Welcome back, YouTubers, to another episode of Java Programming Tutorials for Beginners. Today we're going to be covering our first advanced Java classes topic, static. Specifically, the static keyword in Java. What is it and what does it do for you? On the screen I have a quick example thrown up involving a class called RobotFactory. On the left-hand side we can see the declaration for the class, or the blueprint. It's got 6 member variables, 3 member variables and 3 member methods. The 3 variables are a private integer called robotsMade, and this will store the number of robots made by this specific instance of the class. The next variable is private string factory name, and this string will contain this specific instance's factory name. The last private variable is a private static variable called total robots, and this is an example of what a static variable looks like and how the syntax for the static keyword is used. We'll talk more about what functionality that contains later. The 3 methods are a constructor, pretty standard. You pass in the string as a parameter, which is the name for this instance of RobotFactory. The next member method is makeRobot. This will basically increment our robots made counter and then also increment the total robots counter. There will also be a method called getNumRobotsInWorld, and this is an example of a static method, and we decided to make it a public method, and it returns a type integer, and it will basically be a way of accessing our private static variable. Okay, so what does static actually do? Static basically declares this whatever method or variable to be unique to the class definition, whereas most methods or variables within a class are unique to the instance of the class. So what that means, for example, is if I have 3 instances, so now we're looking at the right-hand side of the screen, if I have 3 instances of RobotFactory, they each contain, for example, their own local copy of a variable called robotsMade. So if I were to look at any given time the robotsMade variable in the first instance and compare it to the second instance, since it's 2 different locations in memory, the values of those variables could be different. However, if I were to look at the variable total robots within the first instance or the second instance or the third instance, that's all referencing the same spot in memory. It's specifically referencing basically the declaration for the class is where that's stored. And so the value of that variable is going to be equal across all 3 instances because it's actually referencing the exact same spot in memory. And same thing for static methods versus private methods, versus non-static methods. Static methods will be the same, will reference the exact same method definition or implementation across all 3 classes, whereas a standard non-static method will have its own unique local copy in memory. So with that, let's go ahead and code up our example for this episode. Let's go ahead and make a new project, and let's call it the RobotFactory example. And we'll make a new class, and we'll call that class RobotFactory. We said that the RobotFactory has a constructor, so let's go ahead and create that. RobotFactory, it's going to take a parameter called name, and it's going to be of type string. There's going to be 3 member variables within this class. One of them is static. Let's go ahead and declare the static one first. We We said it was an integer called total robots. Next, there were two private variables. One is an integer called robots made, and the other one is a string called factory name. It is a good practice to set a default value for your static variables, and here's why. If you were to set the default value in the constructor, every time you create a new instance of the class, it's going to reset the value for that static variable. And you may not want to do that because your other instances of the class are actively using that static variable, and it would possibly be a bug for them to just randomly have that variable be reset to the default value. Our implementation of the constructor is pretty simple. It's just going to be setting the factory name to be equal to the name, and you're going to set the number of robots made for this instance of the class to be 0. There were two other methods within this class. One was called makeRobot, and all this is going to do is increment the robots made counter by 1, and then it's also going to increment the total robots counter by 1. Notice that I can actually access this static variable within this class because it is private. If I were to try to access it outside this class, I would not be able to. I've decided to add one additional method here, and it's basically going to be a getter for the number of robots made. So, and the reason why we want this is so we can see how many robots this specific instance of the of a RobotFactory class is made. So we'll go ahead and return robots made. And then lastly, we have our static method, which is going to return a type integer, and it was called getNumRobotsInWorld. And this is just going to return the static integer. Alright, let's go ahead and create our main class that's actually going to be run. Call it main class, and because we need an entry point for our application, we need to have a public static void main, so make sure that this checkbox is select and click finish. And then the first thing we want to do is declare 3 instances of RobotFactory. Factory 1. We'll just call it Factory 1. And we're going to replicate that 2 more times. 2 and 3. And then let's go ahead and do a quick printout statement. Say total number of robots. And this one, okay, now is where it's going to start to get interesting because we're going to want to call our static method. So that's how you call a static method. We haven't seen this syntax before. Previously, in order to call a method of a class, we always need a instance of a class and do instance.methodName. In this case, because we're using a static method, we can just go ahead and do the actual class.methodName. Now that doesn't mean that you couldn't do it the other way. We could actually change this to be factory 1 and use the instance.methodName, getNumRobotsInWorld. But notice that our IDE highlights this in yellow and says you're accessing a static method. It's preferred if you do it the other way. But you can do it both ways, and to show you, let's go ahead and click the Run button. And sure enough, we see the total number of robots in the world is 0. And the reason why they're 0 is because we set the default value to be 0. Okay, so the next thing let's do is to have each factory make a robot. There's factory 1, 2, and 3. And then we want to print out the number of robots that each factory has made. So factory 1 made robots, we'll say, and then we'll do factory 1 dot get robots made. We're going to replicate that for factory 2 and factory 3. Okay, let's go ahead and print that out. Here we go, and we see that each factory made 1 robot. It's looking good. And now let's go ahead and copy paste that top line down there again and see what that prints out. 3. Very interesting. The reason why that happened is because each one of these instances of RobotFactory is actually using the same total robots variable. So what that means is in memory there is only one total robots variable and all instances of the RobotFactory class are using it. Whereas, for example, the variable robots made has a separate location in memory for each instance of RobotFactory. And so when we print out, when we go back to our main class and we print out the get robots made value, which is referencing the robots made variable, which has a separate location in memory per instance, of course the value for that is 1, because we only made 1 robot in each factory. Whereas our static variable, which all instances using the same location in memory for that variable, that's going to be 3, because we made 3 robots. So this has been another episode of Java Programming Tutorials for Beginners. Today we have covered the static keyword in the Java programming language. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comment section below.